Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. You may remember that in October I reviewed the 1955 British film The Quatermass Experiment. Today I'm following up on that with a discussion of its 1957 sequel, Quatermass 2. Val Guest directed this film as well, and again it starred Brian Donlevy as the titular scientist. In this story, Quatermass's failure to obtain further funding for his moon project coincides with a chance run-in he has with a man and woman on the road, the man afflicted by a strange injury. Bizarre findings about the rocks that caused this injury, plus an increase in meteorite activity, send Quatermass to a blocked-off site to investigate, only to find himself drawn into a deadly mystery with global implications. As was the case with other Quatermass films, this is a big-screen adaptation of a television miniseries. The original 6-part serial aired in 1955 and starred John Robinson, who replaced Reginald Tate after his sudden death. To distinguish the two adaptations, the miniseries title is written as Quatermass 2 with Roman numerals, while the film title is written as Quatermass 2 with an Arabic numeral. This is considered the first use of an Arabic numeral in a film's title to identify it as a sequel. In the United States, the film was also released as Enemy from Space, because apparently the name Quatermass alone wasn't enough to sell tickets. Though character and series creator Nigel Neal vehemently disliked the previous film in general, and Brian Donlevy's Quatermass in particular, having bitter words to say about the casting, the performance, and the actor himself, he must have set those feelings aside, at least temporarily, because he worked with director Val Guest to adapt his teleplay into a screenplay. But rumor has it he still wasn't happy with the final product. As for me, I approached this film differently than I had the first one. I didn't know I was going to give the Quatermass Experiment its own solo review until halfway through the movie when I thought, I'm really enjoying this is really good, I want to tell people about it, then I definitely have enough material to make a whole video. It was an unplanned thing, and I thought it turned out really well. If I do say so myself. This one was different. I had already decided going into it that I would give it a solo review, but also, because I had enjoyed the first movie so much, this time I had expectations. Much like the preceding film, Quatermass 2 is a sci-fi horror thriller. It has a sense of excitement and does a good job building tension as the plot thickens, even though it's not quite as big on atmosphere as its predecessor. It's got great music, which adds a lot right from the get-go. Both films have the same composer, James Bernard, who scored many a movie for Hammer Film Productions, but my mom had the same thought as me, that the music in this one stood out more. It really upped the ante in certain scenes. This film also has good imagery, like a road to nowhere with armed guards hidden among the trees, workers who wear masks that render them expressionless and threatening. Much of the film occurs at this huge plant, at least the way it's filmed makes it seem huge. Special credit is given to the Shellhaven refinery, which had been featured in the TV serial as well. This industrial setting really gives this film a different feeling from the previous one, and I imagine getting permission to shoot the movie here was a major win for the production team. The obvious reality of the sets bolsters the authenticity. Plus, it's a cool place to stage a horror movie. It's not necessarily a scary movie, but it is tense, and it has its moments. There's a brief, startling shot of someone getting run over by a car. It made me jump because I was so sure that it wasn't gonna happen, and then whoop! But the most shocking moment, probably the most famous moment, I would guess, is one that shows this industrial setting off the most. A man appears at the top of a tower, screaming in terror and pain. He comes staggering down the stairs, and he's just covered in muck. I give them full points for how thorough they were. The actor must have been cleaning stuff out of his nooks and crannies for days. It's a great alarming sequence, and a revelatory moment as far as the plot goes. Though it is still odd to see this pinky ring wearing American tough guy playing this renowned British engineer, Brian Donlevy's performance is consistent, and I still don't really have a problem with him in the role. In his way, he owns it, even though it's weird when they have him say something like, "What the devil?" I actually found him more human here. He's still curt, with little time for pleasantries, but at least he apologizes, sometimes, and you get where he's coming from. He's a man with lofty ambitions that extend beyond the launching of a rocket. He's got ideas about colonizing on the moon or other planets. But clearly he's ahead of his time, because all he encounters are setbacks and disappointments. If you were in his shoes, you'd probably be cranky too. Oh, and here's a funny thing. Remember in the previous video I talked about how I always thought it was pronounced Quatermass, but now I know it's pronounced Quatermass. Okay, so I finally get used to saying it that way, although there were a couple of times when I was filming that video where I had to stop and correct myself. And then all of a sudden, here in this movie, they throw a wrench into it by having some people say Quatermass, while others say Quatermass, as in Christmas. Ah! I hadn't even considered that as a possibility. Quatermass? There are only two other characters who return from the first one. One is Inspector Lomax, although Jack Warner has been replaced with John Longden. Longden doesn't have quite as much fun with the role as Warner did, and the character's wife is only mentioned, but he gives a good performance, and he gets a piece of the action. I would have said I'd never heard of John Longden, but while his name might not be one I'm familiar with, I have definitely seen him before. He had a fairly lengthy acting career from the 1920s through the 1960s, and that included appearances in 5 early Alfred Hitchcock films, most prominently 1929's Blackmail, where he co-stars as the detective opposite Annie Andra. I thought that was an interesting bit of trivia. I have seen Blackmail, but I have not yet reviewed it as part of my Hitchcock review series. Also interesting, John Longden plays a police detective in Blackmail, and at least one other Hitchcock movie. Also, at least a couple other non-Hitchcock movies. He plays a police detective here, and he replaces Jack Warner, who may not have been able to take this role because at the time he was busy starring in a TV show where he plays a policeman. The other returning character is Marsh, Quatermass's assistant, who was also recast. Here he's played by Brian Forbes, who, in addition to being a familiar face on screen, especially if you watch a lot of old war movies, went on to become an acclaimed director and screenwriter. Other than that, these are new characters, new associates and assistants, plus new side characters. For me, most of these characters didn't distinguish themselves like the ones in the first film did. An exception is the drunk reporter who shows up at Scotland Yard. I thought at first he was a parallel to Rosie, but then he turns out to be a significant character. Incidentally, he's played by comedic actor Sid James, famous for starring in the long-running Carry On film series. Both Hammer Quatermass films could be classified, at least in part, as creature features. Unlike its predecessor, however, this is a trust no one movie. From early on, you get the sense there's something heavy-cavey going on. There's this top-secret project, and the people involved with it are super sketchy. Is it government shenanigans? Something military? What's going on here? Compared to the first movie, the scale is greater and the stakes are higher, but there's also the addition of this sense of paranoia and hopelessness as the characters discover they can't count on anyone, not government officials, not police, not even regular townsfolk. It introduces that feeling of isolation you find in many Cold War-era sci-fi films. To be sure, this movie brought a few others to mind, and at the risk of giving too much away, I'll tell you that it reminded me of Soylent Green, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Kaltiki the Immortal Monster, and Invaders from Mars. Unfortunately, one thing the two guest Don Levy films have in common to their detriment, in my opinion, is a letdown of a final reveal. They both have tense final acts, and Quatermass 2 actually ramps up the action considerably with a riot and violence and Quatermass himself getting involved in the fight. But there's a reveal near the end that once again I found disappointing. Not that it wasn't interesting. I liked it. Interesting seems a good word to use without saying any more. But the thing is, it's so similar to something the last film had that it gave me the impression of a lack of imagination or creativity. So there's that. I did like the Quatermass experiment better. I found it more compelling, more engrossing, more memorable. It just really made an impression on me. But don't make the mistake of thinking I'm writing this one off. Quatermass 2 is also an entertaining, tense, exciting film. It also has memorable moments. I have to give the first movie the edge, but they're both a good time. I was thrilled by your response when I reviewed the first movie. It was great to find out that so many of you were familiar with it. So now I would like to know, what do you all think of this movie? Do you have a preference for one over the other, or do you like them equally? Do you dislike them equally? I'd love to hear your take on it, so please go ahead and share your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.